transportation is a fundamental right of people to get from one place to another without a lot of grievance. I mean, that's what we all want on a daily basis.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of DNET, the Disability Network. I'm Joe Coughlin.
And I'm Susan Pettit. Today we'll take a look at how transportation affects the right of people with disabilities to make choices.
The 90s could become a very significant decade for disability rights. In the United States, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, will have a significant impact on improving the transportation system. By setting national standards, disabled Americans are assured of uniform access throughout the country. In Canada, the situation changes as you go from province to province. Vancouver is thought by many to be Canada's most accessible city. Throughout the 80s, the city worked to integrate trains, buses, and taxis into a network usable by disabled persons. In Ontario, the combination of a rural and urban mix has presented a challenge to transportation planners. When we come back, we'll take a look at how GO Transit, the provincially operated transit system, plans to become accessible.
Greg Pick is a commuter who lives in Hamilton, Ontario, a community about an hour's drive from Toronto. Pick, who works as a coordinator of public affairs for the Canadian Paraplegic Association, gets up early every morning for the drive to his office in Toronto. It's a familiar routine: time for a quick coffee, a chance to catch the news and weather reports, before heading out the door to join the mass of other commuters on the road. Pick has been commuting from Hamilton every weekday morning for the last 4 years. And like most who observe this particular urban ritual, the chore of this daily drive often turns to a daydream of simply boarding a train and leaving the driving to someone else. For the moment, though, for commuters like Greg Pick, that daydream will remain strictly a dream.
I don't like the commute. It's very tiring. Makes for a very long day. But with respect to myself, I have no other means of transportation outside of the city of Hamilton, besides my own car.
That dependence on the automobile is what separates Pick from the rest of the commuters eastbound from Hamilton. He simply has no other options, and yet that also makes him an exception in the disabled community. The automobile gives Pick the option to choose where he will live and work. For large segments of the disabled population with mobility limitations, those options simply don't exist.
Cities have artificial walls built around them where disabled people are unable, without exception, to move outside of these cities unless they have their own transportation or unless somebody provides it for them. These walls are built because there's no infrastructure in place. Parallel transit systems do not move from city to city. They move within cities. So there is absolutely no transportation available for disabled persons, for the most part, to get from one major city to another major city. And that's a perplexing problem, and there's a lot of issues surrounding that must be addressed by all levels of government.
By late 1993, the drive which Pick now makes to Toronto will become an option. GO Transit, the provincially operated rail and bus system, is in the process of providing access to its key rail stations, which serve the Toronto region. This station, at Aldershot, just minutes away from Pick's home, will be the first accessible station built on the system. When it goes into operation next year, it will join 29 other rail stations, which are being retrofitted to provide access for disabled and elderly passengers. Stations such as this one in Oakville were originally connected to trackside platform levels by a network of stairs. They are undergoing conversion to make platform levels wheelchair accessible. It's the first step in making the whole GO train and bus system accessible. In mid-1991, Ed Phillips, then the Minister of Transportation, stepped up to the microphone and made this announcement at the People in Motion exposition on disabled transportation.
I also have good news regarding our efforts to make commuter transit more accessible and convenient for disabled and elderly persons. GO expects to have its first phase completed by 1993.
But getting to Toronto by GO train will not end the hurdles for a commuter like Greg Pick. This is Union Station, a National Historic Site built in the 20s when passenger rail traffic was king. Union Station opened in 1927, and like most rail stations from that era, Union is located in the prime downtown business district and serves as a hub for many of the transit links in Toronto. For a disabled commuter working in one of the many nearby office towers, commuting by GO train will become a viable option almost immediately. For someone like Greg Pick, who works miles away, Union Station connecting to a parallel system bus or accessible taxi is the only option. Two modes of accessible transportation which currently are impossible to book on a demand basis.
You make GO Transit accessible, but what, as I say, and I get back to my argument, what do you do when you get into Toronto? You sit there at Union Station like a lump on a log for 4 or 5 hours wondering what you're going to do? Can you connect to the parallel system? Are you allowed to connect to the parallel system?
Eve Wyatt is the project engineer for GO Transit. It is her responsibility to make the project accessible and working by 1993. But as Wyatt says, that access is made up of other vital links.
For users, as I mentioned before, this is a real issue, that we can make the GO system barrier-free. But a person still has to get from their home to the GO system, and then they have to get from Union Station to their place of work and back again. And it's only going to be practical when all the links of that trip are equally strong.
Union Station, which operates as the hub of many GO train routes, is the key station undergoing conversion. And converting Union is the most difficult part of the whole project. More than 90,000 GO Transit passengers a day use Union Station. During the rush hours, when up to 30,000 riders pass through the station, Union Station is one giant mass of commuters fanning out from the track levels. With trains often arriving and departing minutes apart, moving disabled passengers safely through the stations will be a major undertaking. And the big question remains, how will disabled GO users access the City of Toronto? This recent meeting of the Toronto Transit Commission was well attended by disabled consumers. Their big concern? Budget cuts that are affecting their ability to access the special transportation networks of metropolitan Toronto. And planners at GO Transit acknowledge that making GO Transit accessible will only increase demand for other services. Eve Wyatt.
The real problem, I think, will be the demands that this places on the capacity that parallel services can provide. As people are going to be expecting more and more from them, it's very costly for them to provide it.
The coming decade will see increasing demand for employment equity programs to reach the disabled population. In order for that to happen, the disabled will first need to be able to reach the transportation systems.
GO Transit accessibility will help a lot of people for employment, I would say, in the downtown area. I know of instances of disabled people in Hamilton who have been offered jobs in Toronto. Had there been accessible GO transportation, I submit that they would have been able to take those jobs in Toronto, without exception.
Coming up next, why is there resistance to accessible taxis? Taxis that everyone can use?
For disabled people who often have to wait for days to book specialized transit vehicles, taxis can provide fast, flexible service. But as this story shows, many taxi operators are in no hurry to make their cabs accessible.
And when do we want it? Now! What do we want? Accessible taxi!
The relationship between taxi cabs and disabled persons has always been very ambiguous. On one hand, the taxis represent freedom of movement. A lot of the time, they are the only means by which a disabled person can secure a ride on short notice. But as a means of transportation, for many disabled persons, regular sedan cabs are very unsuitable. If you are disabled with mobility problems, the use of a regular sedan cab is either physically impossible or a form of transportation in which the physical comfort, dignity, and spirit of the passenger is severely challenged. In short, regular sedan cabs are not very accommodating, but at least you can get around.
Rapid Taxi.
Hi, Brad. It's Kim. I'd like to go over to Pickering Town Centre.
Kim Gale lives in Pickering, Ontario with her 2 small children. Gale was injured in a traffic accident while on vacation in New Zealand several years ago. The accident left her in a wheelchair. Because she requires physiotherapy at a Toronto hospital, Gale has required the use of taxis on numerous occasions. And not all of her experiences have been pleasant.
I can tell you through past experience that if I want to get into a regular taxi, I ask an able-bodied person to go out and wave the taxi down, and generally I hide in a doorway of a store or the office, a doctor's office or whatever, until the person has the taxi flag down, the door open, and my stuff half in it. Because a lot of drivers, they just keep going. As soon as they see someone in a wheelchair, they don't want to get out of their taxi. They don't want to have to fold up a chair.
But that has changed since Pickering acquired accessible taxi cabs. A local company, Rapid Taxi, has expanded its fleet of accessible cabs so that now there are 6 on the road. Today, Gail uses the cabs to get her to her physiotherapy appointments and to augment the service provided by the local parallel transit service.
I can just go. I can pick up the phone and I know that we're going to get where we want to go. And it's a good feeling. It gives me a feeling of the accessibility, being able to go, and the freedom. I would say freedom of choice is the big part.
Pickering is typical of a lot of towns in Ontario where accessible taxis are becoming important links in the local transportation systems. Don Haley is the operator of Rapid Taxi. Originally, he bought 2 accessible taxis because customers kept calling and asking for vehicles they could access. Now he has 6 accessible vehicles on the road, serving the suburban and rural areas of Pickering and Ajax.
I'm not specializing in just wheelchair accessible vehicles because we use it for everything that has to be done. And that's the only reason that it's viable, because it's accepted as a taxi as well as a wheelchair accessible vehicle.
Acceptance of the taxis by the general public is the key to making the whole program work. The initial vehicle costs are much higher, $35,000 to $40,000, as opposed to about $25,000 for a regular sedan cab. The Ontario government kicks in a $10,000 grant to help operators offset that additional cost. That grant has helped put accessible vehicles in dozens of communities throughout Ontario. But one area where they are conspicuous by their absence is Toronto. Metropolitan Toronto only has 7 accessible taxis, just 1 more than the town of Pickering. And while the reasons for that failure in Toronto are complex, they have much to do with the economics and the particular nature of cab service in large cities. Bruce Bell is president of Diamond Taxi, a large Toronto taxi brokerage which controls over 600 taxis. As an operator, Bell says he has looked at the possibility of acquiring accessible cabs as a public relations gesture, but he says the economics of scale make even that idea unworkable.
Certainly there would be a great public service promotion attached to it. It would make the taxi industry or a taxi company, whoever gets into it, look like a very good corporate citizen. It's just a matter of how much you can afford for a public relations gesture. If I had 10 of those vehicles in Diamond right now, sure as hell I would have 10 being wanted in Scarborough when the 10 are located and working in Etobicoke. To try to get them from Etobicoke to Scarborough is a cost. It's cost for dead mileage, it's mileage that you're not getting paid for, and really that's all we have to sell.
And Bell says that due to the recession, he is selling even less of that mileage. Like the rest of the economy, the taxi industry is hurting. Revenue is down. People out of work do not take taxis. The GST is still making its impact on the fare box. And like a lot of business, the taxi industry is crying the blues. Take Taxi News, a local industry newspaper. Its pages are jammed with the issues facing the taxi business. There are ads for old police cars, which you can buy for around $5,000. Concern about the impact of the GST and the accessible taxi issue gathers its fair share of ink. In fact, most of the concerns surrounding accessible taxis show up for debate in these pages, like this one. A fear by some taxi industry insiders that the provincial government is trying to pass off some of the cost of moving the disabled onto the taxi industry. And that rankles David Haynes. Haynes is responsible for the implementation of the accessible taxi program in the province. He is also convinced that the accessible taxi is profitable to operators willing to take a chance.
Every time I hear the argument that we are trying to pass the responsibility over to the private sector, I'm amazed. It's absurd, an absurd suggestion. What we're suggesting is that disabled and elderly folks should have the same options and access to services as everyone else. It's a common sense situation. What we're saying to the taxi industry in this particular instance is the disabled and elderly community are real. They are part of the whole. They are part of the market. They have the same needs, wants, and desires as everyone else because, in fact, they're no different than everyone else. We're not passing the buck. We're saying to these operators, look, open your eyes and recognize the market.
But recognizing the market is what Bruce Bell claims he is doing. Bell says that to reach both the disabled community and the regular public would require a marketing plan, and marketing plans are expensive.
Number one, there would have to be quite a marketing campaign. You would have to develop a customer base almost overnight. And while the government seems to think that that customer base is there, it still takes a while to develop it.
To complicate the issue, Bell says the public also needs to be educated. According to Bell, when the public see accessible vehicles, they don't always understand that it's a taxi they can also use.
The difficulty there is a public perception. The public look at a vehicle or a taxi cab vehicle and they want to see a Chev or a Ford or something that they're used to. If they saw a vehicle with a very high roof, they may not even recognize it as a cab and wouldn't as readily flag it down.
To test that public perception, Disability Network borrowed an accessible taxi from Royal Taxi, one of the two companies using the vehicles in Toronto. We parked the vehicle on a downtown street and invited the public to take a look.
A Royal Taxi, well, it's probably a vehicle for the wheelchair, people in wheelchairs, is it?
Yes, it is, but it's also a regular taxi. Would you ride in this taxi?
Would I ride in it? Well, if I was handicapped, I guess I would.
No. Well, it doesn't seem to be built for regular people.
Would you ride in this taxi?
Yeah, I would.
Would you ride in this taxi?
Why not? Certainly. Assuming that the price was competitive with other taxis. Yes, very much.
It looks very comfortable, it looks accommodating for packages, and it's a great idea for wheelchairs.
Royal Taxi is one of the two companies using the vehicles as part of its regular fleet. Royal Taxi has a contract currently with Wheel-Trans, the local Toronto parallel transit service. As part of its agreement, Royal Taxi fills the gap when Wheel-Trans cannot meet its own service requirements. A lot of people in the industry see that type of contract as the solution to offsetting the initial high cost of an accessible cab. Carol McGregor represents PUSH, Ontario, Persons United for Self-Help, a disabled consumer group which has been active in the accessible taxi issue.
We have people, for example, who, if they have to go to the hospital, are being transported there by ambulance because there's no taxi to take them. So in doing so, they're left, they cannot take their wheelchair, they have to go by stretcher, and then if they have to get home, then they have basically no wheels to get them home, so they have to phone another another ambulance to take them home. Well, how much is that costing the taxpayer?
And it's clear that the solution to getting more accessible cabs into a market like Metropolitan Toronto is to find a way to cut the higher costs which operators face in that market. Howard Moscow, a Metropolitan Toronto councillor, suggests the solution would be for the provincial government to pick up more of the cost.
Well, I think the easy way out would be for the Minister of Transport to increase the capital subsidies. And I don't think that's difficult to do because they budgeted for, I understand, about 50 disabled taxis.
For now, there are two things which everyone agrees on. Metropolitan Toronto needs more accessible taxis, and getting those taxis will be a slow process. But there might be a lesson to be learned from Vancouver. That city stepped up the process by issuing extra licenses to operators who were willing to buy accessible taxis. Howard Moscow, however, dismisses this idea, saying that the Vancouver cabs are somewhat less than desirable.
The vehicles are decrepit, they're falling apart, and they're largely unsafe. And it's not the kind of system I would accept for Metropolitan Toronto.
But Carol McGregor has this to say.
They may be old, but folks with disabilities aren't that fussy. If it runs and it can get them from point A to point B, they're going to take them.
Ahead on DNet, your chance to let the federal government know what you think about access to bus travel.
People in wheelchairs still can't travel by bus across Canada. Should the system be changed? That question is the subject of a series of public inquiries taking place across the country during 1992. The hearings are being held by the National Transportation Agency in response to concerns that there has been almost no improvement in accessibility on intercity bus services. Joining me now is Chris Stark from the National Transportation Agency. Mr. Stark, why should people participate in these hearings?
As you know, Joe, many people have been talking for years about the difficulty of traveling long distances on intercity buses. This will be a chance for these people to air their views, to hear from industry what their problems are, and to hear what government has been doing. So it's an opportunity to learn and to share experiences.
Now, how can people with disabilities participate in these hearings?
People can participate by either sending in written briefs in Braille, large print, tape, or whatever format is most comfortable for them to use, by using our toll-free telephone numbers, or sharing their experiences with us by appearing at one of more than 20 hearings being held across Canada this year.
Now, if a disabled consumer shows up to these hearings, what are they going to get out of the inquiry?
They will have an opportunity of putting their personal views on the public record, having them seriously considered for the report which will be made to the Minister of Transport, and also having an opportunity to play a key role in looking at a very serious and concerning problem for many Canadians.
Mr. Stark, thanks for joining us here on DNet.
My pleasure.
If you want to participate, or if you want more information, here are the numbers to call. First of all, you can record a statement of your views by calling these toll-free numbers: 1-800-563-6824. The TDD number is 1-800-561-3128. If you want information, call collect, area code 819-953-9909. Or the TDD number is area code 819-953-9705.
The first hearings take place in St. John's, Newfoundland, March 17th, and they continue across the country until November.
And that's our show. I'm Joe Coughlin.
And I'm Susan Pettit. Happy motoring. Our address is the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6. That's the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6. Or you can fax us at 416-975-5636.